I could feel the tension from the drive melting away as I stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of salt and pine. It was the kind of freshness you could almost taste. My parents, already out of the car, stood in awe, their faces lit up by the beauty of the place. I saw my dad's shoulders relax for the first time in days, the weight of his work worries temporarily forgotten. He turned to my mom, a smile spreading across his face as he gently squeezed her hand. "Can you believe this?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. My mom nodded, eyes wide, her smile bright. She looked younger somehow, like the years had slipped away in the face of the ocean breeze. It was rare for us to get time like this together, time without distractions, without phones, without the constant pull of obligations. But the peace of the moment didn't last long. The front desk clerk's face fell when she looked at our reservation. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, her voice strained. "It seems there was an error with your booking. We have only one suite available and it's already been assigned." I caught Jack's eye as we walked up to the room. His face was neutral, but I could see the flicker of hesitation in his expression. I forced myself to breathe. It was just a room, just a bed. It wouldn't change anything. Night came slowly, like a tide that crept in without notice. The room darkened as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the walls. I lay there, trying to settle, staring at the ceiling, pretending I was comfortable. The bed was too close to the window, and the soft hum of the ocean below didn't help ease the tension that had started to build between us. I could hear Jack shifting on the other side of the bed, and every rustle of the sheets felt amplified in the stillness of the night. In the quiet darkness, I could hear Jack's steady breathing, his presence palpable, filling the space between us. I told myself to stop overthinking it, to just sleep, but it was hard to ignore the way his proximity felt different now, the way my body was acutely aware of every slight shift, every accidental touch. At one point I felt the warmth of his hand brush against mine. It wasn't deliberate, just a casual movement in his sleep, but it sent a jolt through me, straight to my chest. I pulled my hand back quickly, as though it had been burned, and drew in a shaky breath. The bed creaked, a soft sound that felt so loud in the silence. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, trying to block out the feeling of his body so close to mine. I had to get some sleep. I couldn't keep thinking about it, but then I heard him shift again. I could feel the tension in the room, thickening, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the physical closeness, it was the emotional weight, the weight of something unspoken that neither of us had addressed. I rolled onto my side, facing away from him again, trying to push everything out of my mind. I felt the coolness of the pillow against my face, and for a moment, I thought sleep might finally take me. But even then, I couldn't stop the image of his face from flickering behind my closed eyelids, his eyes soft but full of something I didn't understand. Morning arrived too quickly. I forced myself out of bed, grateful for the few moments of solitude that came with a quiet morning. I slipped into the bathroom, the cool tile beneath my feet a welcome contrast to the heat that seemed to have settled in my body overnight. The shower felt good, the hot water rushing over me, a brief escape from the growing discomfort. I let the steam fill the room, closing my eyes, trying to center myself. But then, just as I was beginning to unwind, I heard the bathroom door creak open. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. There was no mistaking the sound of footsteps, the soft shuffle on the other side of the door. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Had I left the door unlocked? No, of course not. I turned quickly, and to my horror there was Jack, standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock. "Shit," he gasped, his voice strained, before quickly pulling the door shut behind him. But the damage had already been done. My pulse was hammering in my ears, my body instantly burning with embarrassment. I had barely a second to grab the towel from the hook beside the shower, wrapping it around myself as quickly as I could. "Jack!" I hissed, though my voice was more shaky than I intended. "What the hell are you doing?" I'm so sorry," he stammered, his face flushed as he backed away from the door. "I didn't mean to. God, I didn't even realize. I could hear the panic in his voice, but all I could feel was the sting of humiliation. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be easily brushed off. You can't just barge in like that, I snapped, my face burning with mortification. The towel felt like it was barely holding together as I stood there, my heart still racing. There was a long pause before Jack's voice came through the door again, quieter now. I didn't mean to. I didn't think. I'm sorry. His words were rushed, but they had the edge of panic in them, like he wasn't sure how to make things better. And I wasn't sure I wanted him to. You need to leave, I demanded, trying to steady my breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. The tension was suffocating. I could feel the weight of it pressing against the thin bathroom walls. There was a pause. Then, finally, I heard him walk away. His footsteps were slow, heavy, the sound of him retreating almost worse than his accidental intrusion. It felt like an apology that could never be enough. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady myself, but the awkwardness of the situation lingered like a cloud in the small bathroom. What had happened? It wasn't just an accident, was it? The embarrassment still clung to my skin, and though I tried to convince myself it was no big deal, it wasn't that simple. I couldn't stop thinking about how close he had been, how we had been standing just a few feet away from each other, and for a brief moment, I'd wondered if he'd looked at me differently in that second before he realized his mistake. But I couldn't allow myself to go there. It was just a mistake. That's all it was. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The breakfast that morning was painfully quiet. My parents, oblivious to the awkwardness that had settled between Jack and me, chattered excitedly about the plans for the day. A family tour of the island was on the agenda, something to take our minds off the tension, they said. I nodded along, forcing a smile as I pushed my food around on my plate. Jack sat across from me, his eyes darting from the eggs to his coffee, occasionally glancing at me in that strange, knowing way that made my stomach turn. We left the hotel after breakfast, the crisp air of the morning offering no relief from the strange, unsettling feeling that clung to me. The island was stunning, rolling hills stretched out ahead of us, lush and green, the ocean a never-ending backdrop. It was the kind of place that made you forget about everything else, the kind of place that seemed to promise an escape. But for me, the landscape only seemed to amplify the distance between Jack and me. As we walked along the path, the others ahead of us, I couldn't shake the tension. Every time I stole a glance at Jack, his eyes would be on me too. There was something about the way he looked at me now, something that made my heart race and my breath catch. It wasn't the same as before. There was an intensity there, something unspoken but palpable, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. I tried to focus on the scenery, on the lush green hills and the way the sunlight danced across the water, but every step felt like it took me further into a labyrinth of awkward silences. We both stayed quiet, speaking only when absolutely necessary. My mother was babbling about the history of the island, her voice cutting through the air like a distraction, but the words didn't register. All I could hear was the rhythmic thud of my heart and the occasional too long glance from Jack. At one point, I caught him looking at me, his gaze lingering a second too long before he quickly looked away. It was like he was watching me, studying me, and my skin prickled with the awareness that I couldn't hide from it. I can't believe how beautiful it is here, my mom said, looking out at the view as we approached a lookout point. She seemed to be trying to fill the silence, to bring us back into the warmth of family conversation, but I wasn't sure I could just slip back into that, not when there was something between Jack and me that neither of us was acknowledging aloud. The tour guide spoke about the island's history, and I nodded along, trying to look interested, but I couldn't focus. Every time I looked at Jack, the strange energy between us pulled my attention away. The soft rustling of his clothes, the subtle movements of his body. It was all so much more apparent now. Jack was no help either. His eyes lingered on me, his expressions shifting, unreadable. There was something in the way he watched me that made my stomach churn and my chest tighten. I couldn't tell if he was trying to figure me out, or if he was simply as lost as I was. The group continued walking, But I fell behind a few steps, Jack doing the same. There was an unspoken understanding between us that we needed the distance. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me when he spoke, but I could hear the hesitation in his words. His gaze was fixed ahead, but his hands were shoved deep in his pockets like he was trying to hide his nerves. "I'm fine," I replied stiffly, not sure if I was lying to him or to myself. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to pretend like everything was fine. But I couldn't. Not when every glance between us felt so loaded. As we reached the hotel, I felt the distance between us growing even wider, even though we were walking side by side. Neither of us spoke, and the silence felt louder than any conversation we could have had. Dinner was an exercise in forced normalcy. My parents chatted excitedly about the day, but I couldn't bring myself to focus on anything other than the electric silence that hung between Jack and me. Every glance he shot my way made my heart race, and I could feel his presence across the table like a weight pressing down on me. "Try the lobster, sweetheart," my mom said, her voice cheerful. But I barely tasted the food, barely listened to her. I was too aware of Jack, who was avoiding my gaze yet always seemed to catch mine when I wasn't looking. The subtle tension in the air was impossible to ignore. "Are you two coming to the beach after dinner?" Dad asked, breaking the silence. I hesitated, glancing at Jack, whose jaw was tight, eyes glued to his plate. "I'm tired," I muttered, trying to escape the pressure of the moment. Jack echoed the sentiment quietly, his voice strained. Neither of us wanted to make it worse, but not saying anything only seemed to make it worse. The rest of the meal was a blur, consumed by the weight of unspoken words. Jack and I barely spoke, even as we walked back to the hotel afterward, our steps falling in sync but not quite together. The space between us was palpable, and I couldn't tell if we were growing closer or further apart. But one thing was certain. The tension wasn't going away. It was only getting stronger. Back in the room, the air felt heavier than ever. The door clicked shut behind us, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Jack was by the window, his back to me, staring out at the dark sky. I tried to focus on anything else, the bed, the view, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, but everything felt too close. I went over to my side of the room, sitting down on the bed, trying to put some distance between us. But even then, I could feel him. I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against me from across the room. Every shift of the sheets, every slight rustle of his clothing, it all seemed amplified in the silence. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? Nothing felt right. Jack moved to sit at the edge of the bed, his hand running through his hair, his eyes avoiding mine. His movements were restless, like he was unsure of what to do with himself. I lay down, my back to him, trying to force my body to relax, but it was impossible. Then, without thinking, I felt his breath on my neck. He had moved closer without either of us realizing. My body tensed, my heart skipping a beat, and I froze, the air between us crackling with something I couldn't understand. He pulled back, but the damage was done. The distance between us felt smaller now, almost non-existent, and the feeling of being too close was unbearable. I could hear his breathing, steady but heavy. The weight of the moment was suffocating, and every part of me screamed for space. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore how close he was, how it felt like the room was shrinking with each passing second. And the more I tried to block it out, the more I realized that this, whatever this was, wasn't something I could just wish away. The night seemed to stretch on forever. After our parents had gone to bed, we found ourselves on the roof, the cool breeze from the ocean swirling around us. The quiet was thick, the kind of silence that felt like it was waiting for something to happen, something to break the stillness. We didn't speak at first, standing side by side at the edge of the roof, staring out at the dark expanse of water. The stars above us were brilliant, scattered across the sky in sharp contrast to the void beneath us. I could feel Jack next to me, but there was a strange barrier between us now, like a tension that neither of us knew how to release. Finally, Jack turned toward me, his eyes soft but intense. He hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. But words didn't come. Instead, he reached out and brushed his hand against my arm. It was a simple touch, but it set my skin alight. The contact sent a wave of heat through me and my breath caught in my throat. He was standing too close now, the distance between us practically non-existent. His face was inches from mine, his gaze fixed on my lips. I wanted to pull back, to stop this before it could go any further, but I couldn't move. I couldn't pull away. And then, without warning, his lips were on mine. The kiss was electric. It wasn't just a kiss, it was the culmination of everything we had avoided, everything we had tried to ignore. It was the breaking point, the moment when everything that had been building between us finally erupted. His hand slid to my neck, pulling me closer, and I responded without thinking, my hands moving to his chest. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the kiss, the rush of emotions flooding through me like a tidal wave. It was everything I had been trying to fight, and yet, in that moment, it felt impossible to stop. My mind raced, but my body was overwhelmed by the sensation of being so close to him, the heat of his touch, the overwhelming feeling of connection that had nothing to do with family or boundaries. When the kiss finally ended, we both stood there in stunned silence, our faces still inches apart. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what this meant. Jack didn't speak either. He simply looked at me, his eyes wide, his expression a mix of shock and something else, something I couldn't place. But in that moment I knew. I knew this was something we couldn't take back. And as we stood there, both of us frozen, the weight of what had just happened settled over us like a thick fog. I didn't know how to feel, but I knew one thing for sure. We had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning came like a punch to the gut. I woke with a jolt, the weight of the kiss still hanging heavily in the air, clouding my thoughts. I barely slept, my mind replaying the moment over and over again, the way his lips had felt against mine, the shock of it all, the mix of fear and desire. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a moment of weakness, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better. I was in the bathroom when it happened. I was standing in front of the mirror, splashing cold water on my face, trying to wake myself up when I heard the sound. It was a soft rustling, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, and then the sound of my mom's voice, calling out. I froze, the reality of what we had done hitting me like a wave. My mind raced. Could she have seen us? There had been no one around when we kissed, no one near the roof. But now, with the sound of her voice, I realized how easily it could have happened. I tried to push the thought away, but my heart was already hammering in my chest. Before I could react, I heard her voice again, clearer this time, coming from the direction of the back garden. "What are you two doing here?" I rushed to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to get a glimpse, and my stomach dropped. There, standing in the small grove beneath the hotel, was my mom, holding her camera, her mouth open in shock. Jack and I were standing there, too close, caught in the middle of an impossible moment. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the expression shift from confusion to something else, something darker. "Mom," I started, my voice barely above a whisper, my heart pounding in my throat. What are you two doing?" she demanded, her voice shaking with disbelief. She took a step back, her camera lowering as if she didn't know what to do with it, her face pale. The air between Jack and me was frozen. I glanced at him quickly, and I could see the panic in his eyes, the same look mirrored in my own. It had happened so quickly, and now, in the cruel light of reality, we were exposed. There was no turning back. There were no words that could undo what had just happened. We had crossed the line, and now our secret was out. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, but nothing came out. There was no explanation that could make sense of this, no way to explain why it had happened, why we had crossed the boundary we had spent our whole lives respecting. "Mom, I don't know what to say," I finally managed. my voice trembling. Jack, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward, his voice low and apologetic. We didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his words barely audible, his face filled with guilt. My mom didn't say anything for a long moment. Her eyes flicked from me to Jack, and then back to me, as if she was trying to make sense of the impossible. I can't believe this," she whispered. "I never thought—" Her words trailed off, and the weight of the moment pressed down on us all. There were no more questions, no more explanations. It was clear that everything had changed, and nothing could ever go back to the way it was before.